Hello. Yeah, I realized this morning that I've been doing talks like this for a while now, and I still get a bit nervous. So if I start speaking too fast or mumble, because I mumble anyway, or shake a bit, just ask me to repeat something, because it happens. But yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. The amount of, I'm going to try and carry on talking till about 1:45, so time is, we'll see how that goes. Yeah, great. So I've got into a bit of a habit of trying to always start talks with a kind of acknowledgement and thanks to the kind of, I guess, the network of conversations and ideas which I exist within, because none of the things I'm going to say are things that I've done by myself or thought by myself. They all come from conversations, working collectives, friends, lovers, things I've read or listened to. So, just a kind of like acknowledgement in the way that you would tell a story, like your friend tells you a story about something that happened to them. This is a kind of continuation of a story. And I think it also is important as a starting point to approach today with an intention around kind of actions at a small scale and how those things spiral out. So if this is an idea about collectivity around knowledge and sharing and the reality in which we all live, which is one which is not individual, which is one which is supported and propped up by so many different kinds of people and infrastructures and energies and organisms. So, just a kind of interconnected acknowledgement to start with. I'm going to talk quite a bit about my work with Assemble. So this is Assemble. And I was working with the group for the past 12 years. I left last year. And so I'm going to talk a bit about the work that we did together over that time. And then hopefully I'm trying to talk particularly about ways of working that I hope will have resonances with what Ram's trying to do here. And then I'll finish by talking about a new network I've started and a project I'm currently working on in London. So we kind of, I guess my own story is that I never studied architecture, but I came to work with Assemble through basically involvement in construction and spending some time on construction sites. This is Rural Studio, which is in Alabama, which is a kind of can you guys see? Which is an outpost of Auburn University, where basically over the past over 20 years now, students have essentially kind of built up their projects. Like student projects are real things for the town. So they build housing, they build the fire station, they build the library, they build skate parks, different things. And always in small teams of 3. But I went there very briefly, but spending some time building there and seeing what was going on completely changed my perspective on everything, because suddenly you could understand the world is being built, and you understand through experience of construction, understand the labor and time and energy that goes into making every single thing that we exist within. So then, I guess this was also a time when lots of different projects in London were kind of experimenting with self-build temporary structures. So that's Exist and the public bathhouse, and this is Frank's by Practice, trying to design processes in the way that they could be done by the people and the labor force that we had available, which was basically ourselves and kind of people that we knew or people who came off the street. We're trying to think about why people might come to that space, and to see a film seemed like kind of a good answer to that, riffing on the kind of like Americana kind of. Oh, this is weird. I'm just going to change the view screen. So that's better. Oh yeah, cool. Yeah, so it's kind of like DIY. A lot of materials that we were just playing around with, experimenting with kind of visual languages. And this became, that was, yeah, it was kind of like falling in love, that project. It was a bit, it was only 5 weeks long. But yeah, here I am still talking about it like 13 years later or something. But it kind of set a tone. We then wanted to continue working with each other and continue working in this holistic way where we were doing programming, we were designing like outfits for us to serve the popcorn, we were thinking about what kind of ice cream we were going to make. We were, trying to tie it all together in some kind of like whole experience that people would come to. So we formed a company and then started to do kind of a series of temporary event projects, which was really because that was all that we could, we had capacity or access to do or were being offered. So this was the Folly for a Flyover, which again was more specifically trying to think about material reuse, but kind of also to celebrate this the like reality of this thing I was talking about before, which is like the city being made by hand. So it was about 15,000 timber bricks, which were cut on site, and each one had 2 holes in, and then they were kind of woven back to scaffolding substructure. The idea being that it could kind of speak to the material provenance of the brick industrial buildings in this part of London, but also was something that people could come and do without having to have the skills of laying bricks, and also to have dry construction, so then it could be dismantled and then reused in a school project in the playgrounds, kind of the other side of the canal. Another project that also was, I guess, we were trying to be mindful, really, even at the beginning, of materiality, and like this was a project which is a project space, a rehearsal studio, recording studio, performance space for Cafe Otto, which is a kind of experimental music venue in East London. And they had this access to this site, potentially, which was owned by the city council, and a small amount of money and a huge amount of people who were completely committed to their kind of musical program. So we were trying to think again about materiality in this context, where you have labor available, some kind of resource which was on the site, which was all this rubble, and how could you work with that to create a building that maybe thought more about these kind of like histories of brick construction and brick fields and clay pits that would have been in surrounding London in the 19th century, but obviously don't exist anymore. But we have huge amounts of demolition, construction, so there's all this other kinds of material waste, like how could we use that? We used these bags, rice bags, they're like misprints, so they were cheap, to build this project space, which is, it's quite a strange space, but it is very well loved. And a lot of the people who built it now also use it, for recordings or practicing, making new bands, experimenting. And I won't talk about that. The floor actually came, I'm going to go back on. The floor came from a Barbican show we had, and then but I guess like with each of these, it was kind of like trying to like talk to any partner or organization involved or who we had contact to try and see where materials could come from and then to rearrange them on the site. So this Assemble has since very early on, I think this was 2011, we first got this building, which became our kind of home, called Sugar House Studios, and it was firstly it was in the east of London, near Stratford, and it was these kind of old, well, like light industrial buildings not being used, and we basically took all the bits from the cinema that we'd built in the first project and then kind of reinstated them, trying to use them as a kind of kit of parts. It was a phrase we used a lot at that time. And we ran a pizzeria there. The pizza was good, but we were really bad at running the pizzeria. So then there was like a middle stage that we luckily don't have any photos of, where it became like a kind of Euro house night, like club. That was also a bad idea. But so then it became this space that was much more focused on a community of people making stuff, on artists, and things that made a little bit more, were more complementary to each other and could like fuel each other in terms of doing projects and work and collaborations. So this is, the project space then became somewhere we could test one-to-one material construction for details. So that was a piece for the Goldsmiths CCA, which is a new art gallery in London that the studio was working on. And since then, Sugar House has then moved into Bermondsey, which is kind of a bit more central, southeast, into a former school building that is also going to be demolished. And so actually this year, in fact, in like only 3 months, in July, it will be the third move, basically. So I guess this is a kind of condition that isn't unfamiliar for people working in city centres, especially if you're working with a practice that needs space or experimentation, and kind of precarious short-term lease situation. But in a way, what was amazing about that was that we had these spaces that could really evolve with us. So it was like a space for testing out ideas, which then failed, and then we could change the organization, discuss what was working, reflect, change, and evolve. And so there's kind of this material and social evolution of the collective, and this is kind of a very basic diagram showing some of the organizational relations that changed over the first 9 years. And again, I guess the context of the space offered particular opportunities for doing projects and research as well. So in the first site in Stratford, we were in the middle of like what is now a huge development project. So there was a phased construction which was happening 5 years, phases at a time. And so we developed a proposal to basically try and respond to this context of scarcity for like studio spaces by developing a project that could prototype a kind of deconstructible, reconstructible, cheap studio building that was also just basically providing the kind of bare essentials and core infrastructure, and then the people renting it would kind of finish off the spaces to their own needs. So over 12 years, Assemble evolved into something which is like much more like a corporation, I guess. So it has a partnership and then lots of different kind of subsidiary organizations which do design projects, play projects, construction, lots of different things. And then these kind of satellites at the bottom are what I'm going to speak about now in a bit more detail. But as we moved from this situation where we were building things in the city and having the experience of making change in our environments, we became really interested and kind of driven by the idea that you could also create projects that facilitate that opportunity to learn and have agency for other people. So then it became a process of basically thinking not just about the material and physical things in the projects, but also about the social structures, the organizational cultures, and the kind of activities that projects provide space for. And so, since basically 2013, that's been a main core part of the work, is basically setting up projects that also are independent, evolve to become independent organizations as well in their own right. And we have different kind of relationship. Assemble has different kinds of relationships to those projects as well. So one of the first of these was Black Horse Workshop, a kind of public, basically a center for making that was trying to think about some kind of hybrid business model where there'd be like multi-layered occupation of professionals, kind of amateurs, and then just the general public, and to have a reason for all those people to be coming in and sharing space and exchanging knowledge. So there's like a cafe and then also quite advanced workshop facilities. In Liverpool, has been working there for, God, I don't know how many years it is now. Maybe 8 years, in the south of Liverpool in a place called Toxteth, which has a very particular and, well, maybe not sad, but telling and frustrating history of bad planning development priorities. So basically, that's skipped one. Anyway, that's Black Horse Workshop. That one I'm not going to talk about. Oh, okay. Well, go to Liverpool afterwards. I think that slide was in the wrong place. Sorry. Okay, so that was a picture of Material Institute, which is a fashion school in New Orleans, which has also been set up. But yeah, delete what I said about Liverpool. We'll get to that in a minute. This is Baltic Street, a venture playground, which is a really, probably the project I'm most proud of being involved with. It evolved out of a public art commission for the Commonwealth Games, which was happening. I guess a lot of our work ended up being situated in places where, like, really high levels of poverty, high levels of unemployment, child deprivation, because that was often where, like, political initiatives for, like, urban development or money would be going. This is in East Glasgow. This is in Dalmarnock. This is on the top right. You can see the outside of the Chris Hoy Velodrome, which is what the commission was attached to. And really it was quite a stunning and bleak experience to go there for the first time, because you're in a place where just there's so much demolition that's happening in the interests of these huge kind of like, sporting events with very little care for, or active, what's the opposite of care? Disinterest for the people who are living there. It's basically a place where, particularly the planning at that point that was going into thinking around the parking that would be needed for this new stadium and the kind of development of the athletes village and this kind of stuff was happening over such a long period of time with so much demolition around it that, it was like really no one was thinking about the people who were living there. No one was thinking about especially the kids who were living there, because you could just spend your whole childhood surrounded by this hoarding or surrounded by disempowering change, which you have no contact to. And with our interest in kind of authorship of space and experimentation and capacity to change the world around you, we became really inspired by the adventure play movement, and that emerged out of the kind of ruins of the Second World War. And we looked a lot at other models where, there's obviously a really good culture of this in some places like Germany and Japan. This is an incredible place in Berlin called Colle 37, where the kids basically rebuild half the playground every year from scratch, and it has multi-stories, and it's incredible. So we wanted to do a project that could be something that the kids had, they had a sense of understanding about what was happening in the place, and they knew they had connection to the process, and it was visible and open to them. It was an interesting project because we kind of started with these intentions to build huge towers and make it highly dramatic and risky, and then actually what we learned through doing research into adventure playgrounds is that for actually the most important thing about them, or the kind of heart of them is this like sense of permission and structures that facilitate a kind of like freedom and agency for kids and autonomy. And it's not about designing the thing for them, it's about creating the conditions so they can continue to redesign it as the project exists. And so it was really then became a process of trying to set up and secure the infrastructure that could enable that to continue for a really long time. So like securing the land, setting up the organization in a good way so that it could continue to respond in a kind of agile way to the conditions of the place that it was in. And it has been amazing because now it's not only an adventure playground, it's also they just opened an outdoor nursery that runs during the day, and they've turned into a kind of food distribution center, and they were supporting like 2,500 families in during the pandemic. And you know, it's really, and it's like that because the project has really just been the people there. You know, we've done, the design work wasn't really about that. It was more like working with, finding the right couple of people, particularly play worker Robbie and his brother Alan, who have been leading on it, and kind of going with them to visit lots of other places where this culture already exists, and then like supporting them and trusting them to develop over time and have control. I guess that's also led into a kind of then spiral of interest in children's rights and their like political agency, their capacity to bring like just the knowledge that they bring and the insight into the world. So there was a film that we made called The Voice of Children, which is on Vimeo, and I recommend checking it out if you have a spare hour, which is a series of interviews with people running child-led spaces around the world and talking about the kind of value that they get from that. There's a couple of us who are still trustees on the project. But yeah, it's also not, you know, you have to really challenge yourself on aesthetics as well. You know, what is it that you're trying to make? Why does it have to look a certain way? Okay, so now we're back to Liverpool. I don't know how much any of you know about a housing initiative, planning initiatives in the UK, but there was a thing in the early 2000s called the Housing Market Renewal Initiative, which basically was a way of trying to incentivize, trying to get people out of poverty and like poor housing situations by buying up large areas of housing and property of land, demolishing them all, and then rebuilding them on a less dense plan. That was the plan. But they didn't get that far because they were doing it on such a huge scale and the financing wasn't available. So this was even before 2008. But there's like streets that look like this still even now across the whole of the north of England, and this happened, 20 years ago. And it gutted communities. And in this particular area of South Liverpool where it hadn't been demolished, how am I doing? Time. Okay. Where it hadn't been demolished, the remaining residents who were like led by kind of mainly older women who basically like kind of sat in front of like the bulldozers who were trying to come in like plastic chairs and like drinking tea in order to stop them coming to the houses at some point. But they started to extend the care that they had for their own homes out into the streets as well. So they started repainting things, clearing out all the rubbish, because the council also stopped collecting rubbish because it had been marked as a place that was not, had no investment and no care. So they restarted a market to replace all the houses, all the shops, the high street that had been lost, and they planted all around the neighbourhood. And it's just, it's a really beautiful place. So we were approached by a social investor to do some work with those residents who'd set up a community land trust to try and take ownership of some houses and redevelop them in a smaller grain way that made more sense rather than having these like huge hundreds and hundreds of houses being developed by, I guess, more removed development interests. And the community land trust is a really interesting model. It's somewhere that sits between, well, it's a mechanism that allows for communities, can be geographical or can be defined in another way, to take ownership of land and property. And it actually has its roots in the civil rights movement in America. It's something which is really spreading a lot in the UK. And there's now ones which are not just about particular neighborhoods, but also about types of use of space. So there's like the Independent Music Venue Trust, which is trying to create secure spaces basically for the long term for independent music venues around the country and things like this. So we worked with them to develop a proposal for the neighborhood, and it was really trying to think about a network of like small scale projects that would happen in the properties and kind of interrelate in a way that produced and supported the kind of already existing networks of solidarity and kind of community organizing that existed. So there was a few different strands to this, one of which was the 10 Houses project, which was designing the renovation for the houses that the CLT had got from the council into affordable homes. There was another project that was looking at 2 adjacent houses to each other that were in really bad condition because of water ingress. So this is where the houses had been boarded up and no one was living in there, so they started to kind of rot away, and to turn that into a kind of arts centre community space and winter garden, because to kind of join these different activities of like community action, which was one gardening and one kind of like creative tenacity, like doing things in the streets, to make space for that to continue. That was just a visualization. We made large models and brought them to the market, and then this was kind of tree planting early on. One of the key things I think about this project was that one person's now moved there forever. He just kind of went and had a kid, never came back. But during the time when we were delivering the projects, a number of us were kind of also like living on the streets, like upstairs in one of the houses. We had like the front room was like the site office, the back room was the kitchen, became this kind of canteen, like a greasy spoon, with one of the neighbours cooking food for all the builders who were working on the houses. And then in the backyard we'd set up this kind of concrete fabrication space, which was using waste material that was coming out of the houses and repurposing it into this kind of almost like terrazzo finish for the fireplace in the houses and for some of the like kitchen surfaces as well. So from the 10 Houses projects, we'd done a series of designs whilst trying to keep it as cheap as possible with like minimal finishing. There was like these like key moments of like, we'd call it the enrichment projects, which was basically like everyone in the collective had like different things to design, so like doorknobs, bathroom tiles, bits of furniture, like ceiling rows, like extraction grate, different things like this. And to try and design them in a way that like meant that each of the houses would still be different, so it was still showing this level of craft and care in that could somehow pay homage to the kind of love that the residents had been showing for their neighbourhood. And so these different elements then became the basis of what we developed. The project was nominated for the Turner Prize, which was a really weird thing that happened. I mean, we were all completely, it was really shocking because we had no idea that it was even within that world or being looked at in that way. But we were trying to think about what that situation offered, which was essentially a kind of media platform for what we were doing. And after getting approval from the communities that we were working with that they wanted to go through this process, then we tried to use basically the designs we'd done for these elements within the house to kind of launch a business and reopen one of the shops in the neighborhood, and start create jobs through this kind of lens of the Turner Prize. So these are some pictures of the house, some of the ceramics, and it was kind of, anyway, we learned a lot. We were very naive, but we also had a good time, and made a lot of different products. So we used the Turner Prize exhibition as a kind of showroom for getting orders, and then spent the subsequent year and a half working out how to fulfill them. And the organization, so Granby Workshop, which is this, the business that we set up, is still going, but now has much more of a focus on in architectural ceramics. So just trying to really narrow the specialism, and it's still thinking about these processes that invite chance, that invite improvisation. So they're not just kind of purely repetitive kind of forms of mass production, but kind of marry these two things whilst making it possible to produce at scale and sustain some kind of handmade ceramics business in the UK, which isn't very easy. Anyway, this is a project that they did recently, a few years ago for Venice Biennale. But it's still going. I guess, so one of the project I'm going to talk about briefly now, which is kind of a, I guess for me it's a kind of gathering of all of the learning that I have had over the past decade, and trying to set up a social centre, which is a space that can advocate for and be in solidarity with people affected by or working towards kind of housing justice, land justice. So it's off Brick Lane. It's an old house off Brick Lane, which is in the east of London, in a place where historically would have been kind of large, very working class area, large kind of industrial spaces, a brewery. This is the fruit and veg market in Spitalfields. And it's also the home of waves of different generations of migration. So when the house was built in 1705, if you walked down the street, everyone would have been speaking French, because it was when the Huguenots were coming from France, fleeing persecution there. And since then, it became a kind of particular home for Jews leaving Eastern Europe, and then for the Bangladeshi community coming kind of towards the end of the British Empire. And so it's kind of, there's a building at the end of our road, which is first was built as a church, then it became a centre for converting Jewish people to Christianity, then it became a synagogue, then now it's a mosque. So it's it's probably the only mosque with a wine cellar, they think. But it's in this, so you're on the edge of the City of London, and where that has historically met the East End. So it's in this extremely high pressure, high land value, high speculation context that is, really, really quite aggressive in the way that it is transforming the spaces, and has done over the past 30 years. So in the 90s, when you came down the street, there still would have been a lot of kind of working spaces in the houses. So lots of leather jacket factories and things like this. And now a lot of them have been renovated and are single houses, often unoccupied. And there's a kind of general trend to gut historic buildings, but retain the facade, and then you get tax breaks, so you can develop what you want. It's cheaper, and there's a lot of this kind of new development that's very empty. And but I guess in the context of London, where the rental market is completely insane, and there's real issues around housing quality and housing availability, both in terms of who it's being built for and what. It becomes a kind of form of banking, not land banking, sorry. Whilst in Tower Hamlets, there's really high levels of child poverty and like huge issues with damp and the quality of housing that a lot of social tenants are experiencing. So it's quite depressing. But we were basically given this house. Assemble was approached with this house. It's like 4 floors and has a basement, by the Edith Marion Foundation, which is a really interesting organization that is in Basel, started by some students of Steiner, to set up something that could stand against speculation, basically, on property, and to try and hold things in perpetuity. And they have over 100 projects across Europe that they kind of support and hold the tenure of. And we've basically proposed to them to work in a way that we did in Liverpool, where we occupy the space and build relationships in the community, understand what really makes sense in that place in order to slowly grow the organization and occupy the house. So this is what it looked like when we first came in. It's kind of still semi, it's not changed much since these images were taken. We've filled in the holes in the floor and made it publicly accessible on the ground floor and the first floor, but the rest of it is a kind of like listening process to try and find out what makes sense and where. It's been a kind of ongoing residency in the house, testing out programs and ideas, and through that situation we've really learned a lot about Annetta Pedretti, who was the woman who lived in the house before us. We're not living there, but sorry. Who was the last resident of the house. And she was a really extraordinary woman. She studied architecture for BA, and then she went on to do her PhD in cybernetics, which I didn't know what it was before we started the project, but it's basically the study of self-regulating systems. So it's like it's originally where the word feedback comes from, cybernetic studies, I think in the 50s, 60s. So it can be any kind of relational system. So it could be like a conversation between 2 people. It can be an ecosystem in a pond. It can be the economy of a country. It could be, you can kind of apply it to a lot of different things. She was particularly interested in the relational aspects of language and also of time. But she set up a printing press in the house and was making these beautiful books, which she called living books, which were a way of kind of setting up a process-led means of production. So they all have kind of different ways of producing the book. So some reference like I Ching, some of them had like things people would put into a box, or they're all kind of like conversational devices. That these things then can kind of live on through conversations as well, and they're really beautiful. Through researching cybernetics and I guess Annetta's work, we've also started to think a lot more about things like Bruno Latour's actor-network theory, and this idea of human and non-human actors and how they kind of interrelate. So we've been like mapping Annetta's work and her ideas in the house and trying to build like a digital architecture so that people who are not in the house physically can also access that remotely. We've been trying to study, she also had kept bees and was making clothes. She developed this whole hive system that was like a series of kind of experimental structures that the bees could live in. And she was really active in a lot of community campaigns, trying to protect like community infrastructure and make and kind of against demolition, basically. So we've been trying to use different prompts in the house, which is this kind of like jigsaw puzzle of what she was intending to generate the program. So that's things like, there was a book called The School for Designing Society, which we ran the first UK version of last year, when the book had kind of spawned a summer school that has been running every year since the early 90s in Philadelphia. But so we did the first UK version last year. Similarly to the books, she also had these like community art projects that would be about producing some kind of object or outcome with different kind of contexts. So this was one she was working on, what would a flag for a multicultural society look like? And they actually even like wrote to the UN and asked to like, it was like this iterative process of producing a flag with community input to try and make something that had a bit of everyone in. And then, yeah, they did actually get a response, but it was 1989, so they said there was quite a lot of going on and they didn't really have space. But we've got the letter actually. So yeah, we're just trying to think about this thing of kind of fractal organization, where like the way we think about, we're using language influences the way we're thinking about the organization, which influences the way we're approaching programming, which influences the way that we're thinking about designing the space, and continuing to have kind of reflection and feedback built into all of our processes. I'm really interested in kind of other sensory means of engaging with space. So we've been doing like sonic meditations and embodied practices as a way of trying to understand also how bodies experience the house and relate to the city around it. Yeah, so there's a number of different layers we're trying to think about spatial justice in the way that we're delivering the project. So it's not just thinking about this building as a kind of resource that unlocks loads of other ways of accessing or engaging with those issues. So not just like thinking about what it is you're setting up. We're setting up a charity to take the lease on the house. And if we're doing that work anyway, how can that then start to act potentially as like the Edith Merron Foundation for the UK? Because the land and property legal system is different, significantly different to what they work with in Switzerland. So they're not interested in infinitely expanding. So is there a way of trying to like capture this work to then also be able to think about in 10, 20, 30 years, like what could this organization be doing? Opening up the space to build resources for people working on campaigns across London, offering free space for communities in the area. 5 minutes, cool. And also trying to think about, that if you're creating a space that's trying to engage critically with the systems that are produced by and reproduce the city around us, like not just defaulting to managing the house based on rental extraction from tenants, because then you'll just continue to do the same thing. So are there ways of like working out kind of a parallel economy that might be able to exist within the house that can also interface with what's outside it? And these are kind of live conversations. And then also, yeah, Annetta was, this is the trust. I'm just going to skip through. Annetta was also building a lot of the house herself, like rebuilding it. Incredibly skilled craftsperson. So we want to try and like, wherever we're doing work in the house, we're always trying to make it into an educational or training opportunity for women or other communities who are marginalized from traditional forms of craft construction and construction more generally. So that's kind of what we want to do through the delivery of the project, and particularly not just have it as like hands-on making, but also to try and have like a political and theory element to that apprenticeship, whatever it might be, because she was doing a lot of the work with her hands, but she was also had this incredible intellectual landscape that she was doing the work through in order to move through her kind of philosophy. And so to try and make sure that we're like marrying those two things. This is just something that I love to show as a way of trying to give a metaphor for understanding the contingency of our experience of like what is built around us, because I think architecture in particular in the development of cities so solid, so big, so that it has this kind of inevitability to it. It feels like it's difficult to imagine that something else might be possible. But this is, I'm sure you all recognize it as a kind of like hand axe, prehistoric man-made object that until, not that long ago in history was thought of as, at least in kind of, in the UK it was called a thunderstone, because they thought it was formed by kind of an act of God and like lightning hitting the ground or something. And I guess this idea of like something that had come, not being able to see the kind of man-madeness of things, not being able to see the decisions that exist within all of the ways that we sit in the space or turn on the lights or, the ways that we manifest the world in with each other. Can talk really quickly about this. Spent quite a lot of time in the last couple of years trying to visit projects that are doing this work of trying to practice new forms of relation or value systems or ways of thinking about community and development and living with an approach that might be more resilient to climate change and thinking more mindfully about the systems which we reproduce. So through that, I've then set up this research network called AB in the context of trying not to just continue to perpetuate the inequalities that architecture in particular seems kind of unable to escape and complicit in, and also to think critically about the labor that we're engaging with when we produce these things. So yeah, this is the business plan, which kind of draws on histories of these kind of 17th century lecture aids about the way that different ideas and concepts are related to each other. So we've just been having a lot of meetings, and it's a way of trying to develop something that looks a bit like this. So it has many different heads, decentralized organization, where things can be made and reflected on in parallel and start to feed into each other, produce new projects, with an understanding that actually we can't just continue to work with a default line of practice and protocol that we've inherited from 100 years ago. That this is a very particular moment in time where we need to be really mindful of the reasons why we're extracting material from the ground, why we're still continuing to build things, why we're using certain technologies, why we're using certain processes. And yeah, maybe there are different ways of thinking about architecture. So yeah, we've got a series of projects that are trying to use research questions as a way of investigating different ideas around public services and construction of projects and labor. So I'm going to skip through this, but afterwards I'm going to go and sit in another room, and if anyone wants to talk about this stuff in more depth, I'm going to be there. I guess one of the key things I wanted to say was being here in the Netherlands, had an experience a number of years ago where we were working on a project that was, at least in its narrative and in the way that it was being communicated between the team, was trying to do a lot of the things I've been talking about in terms of giving people access to space, giving people ownership and authority and agency. But I think it's really important that when people set out to do that, if that is what you want to do in your work, that there's an understanding that you need to be comfortable with relinquishing power as well, and you need to be comfortable with certain forms of aesthetic that aren't your own, because otherwise you're just continuing to think that the value of your own aesthetics and your own taste judgment is the most important thing when, it's kind of compromising. Happy to also talk about a lot of the really amazing work that's happening that I'm aware of, where projects are not only engaging with urban space and neighborhoods, but also thinking about national structures, international systems, and kind of intersectional issues, and how we challenge that through the way that we manage our resources and build networks or material flows. And that's it. Thanks for listening.